Please join me in giving Dave Trabert a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
It's really great to be here again as part of the Pachyderm Frequent Flyer Club. Appreciate the regular invitations here, and you know, it was really John is really a great program chair. When he asked me to come in and talk about the state budget, I said, sure, when do you want me to come? And he said, well, let's think about this now. There's going to be a new revenue estimate come out in November, so we want to wait until then, but then the governor's probably going to make an announcement on his allotments, somewhere around the 9th or so of December, but then there'll be some legislative reaction to that, legislative research, so why don't you be here on the 12th? That should be just about the perfect time to talk about everything that just happened, and you were right, John. You nailed the date. You know, what I want to talk to you about today, I'm going to move through some of this information pretty quickly because there's an awful lot of ground to cover. But I want to start with debunking some of the false claims that exist. As you know, over the past few months throughout the election cycle, there was an awful lot of, it was a pretty high volume of false claims. And we've talked about some of those in the past. It's very challenging to get people who make these false claims. Some people pass information on because they hear it and they just assume that it's correct because it came from media or it came from somebody they trust or it came from a politician, and surely that has to be right. So, but other people know that they're passing it on inaccurate information, including a former state budget director, Dwayne Gosen, who is quite frequently quoted and knows full well that he's misleading you. And Dwayne still refuses to come out and debate me or Steve Anderson. In fact, there was a radio station tried one time to get him to do it. We were in the studio at the same time. He would not go on because you find out what the truth is. They won't allow it to happen. There's a link here to a, there was one debate that kind of happened, it was by happenstance. It happened last week. It was former Senate President Steve Morris. WIBW Radio had tried to put together a debate with Senator Morris and someone from the administration, but as they explained on the air, they, for whatever reason, couldn't get anyone from the administration, so I ended up pinch hitting, and I don't think Senator Morris knew that I was coming. So if you want to have an entertaining 30-minute audio listen, go to that link, and you should all have a copy of the handout so the link is printed on there. It's a really entertaining discussion because it's the difference between a politician making rhetorical statements, basically we can't imagine that government could possibly spend a penny less, and a boring accountant going through the facts. There's, you know, you're going to hear, and certainly we have a perspective. So one of the things we want to encourage you to do is get the facts. Don't, whether it's, and we appreciate it if you trust what we tell you, but don't just take our word for it. Don't just take media's word, or for goodness sakes, a politician's word. Get involved, do your homework, ask questions. You don't have to have the answers. When I was working with reporters in the news business, you know, they were always concerned about not having all the answers. You don't have to have the answers, you have to know the questions. You have to find out if the people you're talking to have the answers. If you ask someone, if you ask a politician, well, what do you mean by that? Can you back it up? And you get the deer in the headlights look, you know the answer to that question. They don't have it, so don't talk about it. But get that information. One of the things, you know, we've heard talk about, and this is one of the mistakes that was made 2 years ago when the governor announced his income tax plan. They call it an experiment. And we all know politicians like to, you know, they exaggerate and flourish and call this an experiment. Well, there's no experiment about it. The experiment's been done a long time ago. This is one element of the experiment. There were 11 states that implemented an income tax since 1960. And every single state now has a smaller share of gross state product relative to their 39 competitors than they did prior. Or it was within 5 years of implementing it, they lost share of gross state product relative to their other 39 competitors. And this is an even more remarkable statistic to me. These 11 states did not have an income tax. They implement an income tax and they lose share of state and revenue tax revenue compared to their other 39 states. They went down. Dollars might have went up, but their share of the pie shrunk. That's an experiment that failed. Now, and there's in fact, the listing is on, oh, let's see, it's on page 19. You should all have, this is one of our new publications, the 2014 Kansas Green Book. This has a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about today, including how much states spend and taxes. There's on page 19, there's a list of those 11 states and how much they've lost in GSP share and revenue share relative to their 39 competitors. Here's the other side of the experiment. While we had 11 states that experimented with higher taxes and lost, we have a lot of states that consistently maintain low taxes and are gaining. And you can see here, we break this out into, you can look back over the last 15 years in private sector jobs. Look at the states that do not have an income tax saw an 18% growth in private sector jobs versus the rest of the states increased by 5.6. We looked at the states with the tax from the Tax Foundation. They do an annual ranking of the states with the highest and lowest state and local tax burden. Well, there it was 15.8 to 7.9, the 10 highest versus the 10 lowest. We also looked at the American Legislative Exchange Council, Rich States, Poor States. We used what they determined the states to be the 10 best economic performance and the 10 worst. You can see whether it's in jobs, wage and salary disbursements, private sector GDP, the states that have the low taxes have far superior economic performance. The experiment's been done. That's been resolved. We shouldn't be calling this an experiment. This is, we're going to implement what works. You know, and people talk about, well, you know, the domestic migration, I think, here is another fascinating statistic because that's people voting with their feet. Domestic migration is U.S. residents moving in and out of states. And you can see that states that have no income tax or low tax burdens or better economic performance are gaining residents. They have net gains from U.S. residents moving in and out of states. And where are they coming from? States with high burdens. Now that also says something to me about the quality of the service. Because government will always say, well, we have better services. Well, there's no right or wrong to that. It's a subjective matter that each individual has to decide. But these domestic migration figures tell me that citizens are making quality judgments about the services available in the states that have low tax burdens. They've found a way to provide good services and low taxes, and it's a good value proposition for people going there. So you've heard a lot over the last few years about trailing the national average and how Kansas is trailing the national average on private sector job creation or a couple other things, and that therefore is evidence that the experiment failed. That is nothing more than the political rhetoric at its finest. If the issue was trailing the national average, my question is, where was the outrage between 2002 and 2006? When private sector jobs increased 1.3% in Kansas and the nation was going up 4.9%. You think it has anything to do with the governor who happened to be in office between 2002 and 2006? Because we really stunk compared to the national average and frankly have for a long time. It's not, this is about political. And one of the overriding themes you're going to hear throughout this is we have a budget issue we're dealing with. It's not an economic issue. It's a political issue. This is all politics. The economics are easy. The economics are settled. The challenge we have here is politics, and that's what these claims about we're trailing the national average is nothing more than politics. As my grandpa would have said, no kidding, Dick Tracy, we're trailing the national average. That's the reason that we did income tax reform. We want to break out of that cycle. He would have said it a little bit more colorfully than I just did. But we've had decades of economic stagnation, and we're trying to break out of that, and that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time. The early signs, though, are pretty encouraging. And these are some things that are very well known if you do your research, but you might not have read much of this in media reports. I can't imagine why that would be. But did you know, for example, that Kansas did beat the private sector GDP growth rate for 2013? Better than the national average, better than our income taxing peers. Looking at private sector job growth, if we look back over the previous 14 years, we grew about 2.31% versus our income taxing peers were a little over 3%. We were at 63% of their growth rate. Since tax reform was implemented in 2013, so if we compare today's job growth to where we were December 12 on a seasonally adjusted basis, now we're at 92%. So we're still trailing. We're a whole lot more competitive. Anybody out there ever run? Now I can appreciate this because when I ran races, I was always toward the back of the pack. When you're at the back of the pack and you want to try to win, do you go like that to the front of the line, or do you pass runners in front of you one at a time? That's what Kansas has to do. When you're in the back of the pack, it's going to take time. You're going to start, first we're going to start catching the people that are more of our peers. Some of the slower growers like ourselves, like we've been historically. It's going to take time. We can't tell people, oh, it's always going to be wonderful. It's just going to be when we do this. It's going to be time. It took a long time to get into this situation. It's going to take time to get out of it. But these early indicators are strong. I mean, we had between the first quarter of 2013 and first quarter of 2014, proprietor income growth in Kansas was 14th best in the country, or 7th best. We had the 14th best rate of personal income growth in the second quarter of 2014. These by no means say that aha, tax reform is a success. These are just early indicators. And they're encouraging. It's going to take time, but the early signs are encouraging. Now, you heard last year a little bit about, there was a big budget shortfall, or a revenue shortfall. It was about 4% of the original amount projected. And anybody who's ever done a lot of government budgeting knows that when state revenues come in 4% away from what someone thought they were going to be 18 months prior, that's not bad. It's still a big number, but it's 4%. The real number was $232 million because the estimates were raised in April before everybody knew about the capital gains impact that was going to hit, that came in April and May. So they raised it $103 million. So what you were hearing about was the state was $338 million short. No, it was $232 million short from the original estimate. They were running ahead of estimates for 7 out of the last 9 months, and so they raised it and didn't know that. Now we should know. That's whole other problem. But the fact is they didn't know about this capital gains issue. And so that's where the bulk of the shortfall came from in revenue. The problem, and here we are with the political problem, the problem with our budget today is that we didn't do what we should have when we passed income tax reform in 2012. We didn't bring down spending. Now, if you were going to nibble at the edges of income taxes, you could maybe get by without changing spending much. But when you change taxes to the extent that Kansas did, you have to bring down spending. It's math. And there just simply were not, and this is a bipartisan issue. You hear, oh, the Republicans this, that. No. There are very few people in either party in Topeka back then, and probably still today, who honestly want to do something to bring down the cost of government. And that's separating. So we need to spend less, yes. That doesn't mean we need to provide less. It's providing the same or better quality service at a better price. How do we bring that down? So, we really don't have a revenue problem. We put these statistics together. This surprised a lot of people, even people who study it. What you're seeing here, this is 2014 tax revenue. All tax revenue that goes into the general fund. It's up 28% since 2004. Now you can see that it dipped in 2014. That's after we cut income taxes. But it's 28% higher than it was in 2004, and inflation was up 24%. So even after we reduce taxes, tax revenue is running ahead of the 10-year inflation rate. And the estimates from the consensus revenue group are that it's going to be up 39% by the end of 17. And if inflation continues on its current trajectory, it would be up 29%. So the gap's getting wider. I look at this and say, we don't have a revenue problem. Our revenues are running ahead of inflation. What do we have? A big old spending problem. Surprise. 2004, if we had increased general fund spending, not only for inflation, but let's throw in population change. Let's pretend that every time we add a citizen, the cost of everything goes up proportionally. It doesn't, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and pretend that it does. If we had raised 2004 spending to this year, we would be at $5.43 billion in the general fund. What's that number above it say we're actually at? $6.43 billion. $1 billion. It's actually like $992 million. I rounded it just because $1 billion sounds nicer. It's easier for me to remember at my old age. $1 billion more than if spending had been increased for inflation and population over the last 10 years. That's a big old spending problem. It is not a revenue problem. Now, why is that so significant other than the duh obvious? Well, now, what's the one thing that drives how much government has to tax? How much they spend. It's that simple. It's math. The more I spend, the more I have to tax. The less I spend, the less I have to tax. So we looked at how do the state spending patterns vary, and what we find is that the states that tax income in 2012 spent 49% more per resident than the states that didn't tax income. Are there any states out there that don't have public schools, highways, social service programs, prisons, revenue departments? I can't name one. 49% more. Some people say, well, but they do it because they must push the cost off to local government. So we looked at what's the spending pattern for the states that have the 10 highest versus the 10 lowest state and local tax burden. Well, there the high spenders are 43% higher than the low burden. States that spend less, tax less. Now, anybody in this room think that government operates very efficiently, makes excellent, I don't care at what level, state, local, national. See, and laughter. This is what happens. And frankly, if you ask a lot of legislators, does government operate efficiently? Oh, hell no. Then ask them what they're going to do about it. Well, you see, that's hard. The feet start shuffling and we quickly head for the exits. And the reason it's hard is because you have to say no to the special interests. You have to say no to the people who profit from excess government spending. That's what a lot of this is about, I think. And then we come back to, it's a political problem, it's not an economic problem. The key to having low taxes is to have good quality services offered at a better price. That means there's fewer spoils to divide. And if there's fewer spoils to divide, there's less power for the people doing the dividing. That's what this is about. We will do anything we can in politics to maintain the status quo. We'll put whatever spin on it we need, lipstick on the pig and so forth, to say everything's fine. We must continue to spend everything we're doing. It's a political issue. We asked statewide, did a public opinion poll. 74% of Kansans said, oh yeah, government could operate 5 to 10% more efficiently. And interestingly, it was exactly the same number. It'd be a different margin of error, but the people in the survey who self-identified as government employees, all levels of government, 74% of them said, yeah, government could operate 5 to 10% more efficiently. Now go ask a bureaucrat if they could. Their employees know they could. Of course they can. Now, with that background, let's take a quick look at some of the state budget issues. We published a 5-year budget plan for Kansas back in September, and this was before the new revenue estimates came out, and we knew that we had expected there to be some decline in the estimates because of that capital gains issue I referenced. When they came back and took that into account, we expected there was going to be a decline. So we looked at three different revenue reduction scenarios and said, what are some of the things that we can do? The goal was, how do we balance the budget without any tax increases, without any, and not only without any tax increases, allowing the marginal rates that are already scheduled to decline to continue to decline, and they can. And also no service reductions. Spending less, yes, but not providing less service, bringing down the cost of the service. What we found was that if, and then when we looked at that, we redid it after the new estimates came out, and if they had implemented our plan, or would implement our full plan, government would only need to operate about 7% more efficiently over the next 3 years. Not each year, total over 3 years. It happened to be right in that swing, and that 5 to 10% in that survey that was a historic question. We just asked it again. It just happened to fall right in the middle of that. It all comes down to, we take this better service, better price approach to government. How do we need to provide this service? Okay, fine. How do we provide it at the best possible price, maintain, or at least maintain, if not enhance the quality, so that we can provide it at a better price and pass the savings on to government? That was the premise of our plan, and the premise that we're continuing to work through with the administration and legislative committees now. One of the things you needed to understand is that those revenue estimates that came out were understated by $183 million. And this gets to, some of the government folks in the room might appreciate this. This is some of the mind-numbing nonsense that goes on in government accounting. There's $183 million set aside in this revenue profile that will not take place. And it's because money gets skimmed off the top. Can you imagine, as a business person, getting a financial statement and says, here's my revenue line, but it's not really your revenue line. It's the revenue you were allowed to keep after somebody took some off the top. Money gets skimmed off the top and sent elsewhere in government. So in statute, there was money, there's it's called the local ad valorem tax relief. So it was $54 million a year. Now, it hasn't been funded since 2003. I won't go into what it is, but this is a program that hasn't been funded since 2003. But legislators didn't take the number out of statute. They just didn't fund it, which is their right. One legislature cannot tie the hands of another. But because they didn't take it out of statute, legislative research says, well, technically we should maybe reserve the revenue. They admit it's not going to happen, but they reserve the revenue for it. City-county revenue sharing, they reserved $35 million next year. It's not going to hasn't been funded since 2003. But these are the unnecessary scare tactics that happen. There's $183 million of this stuff where revenues were reduced for that will not occur. Not a single legislator will say, yeah, there's a real serious plan to reinstate LAVTR or revenue sharing, or to double the amount of money that's going to be transferred out, not budgeted, transferred out to the Bioscience Authority. These are all the kind of the machinations that go on in the budget process. So we looked at, in addition to putting those back in, we had revenue enhancements. One of them, the KDOT surplus, you heard about, and I'll get into the governor's budget allotment here in a second, but there was, taking some of the surplus was part of the governor's budget allotment. The surplus comes, whether it's in KDOT or another agency, when government gets more money than it needs to provide services each year. And it's just like your personal checking account. If you put more in than you take out, you build up a balance. And so there's these fund balances, these surpluses in government agencies. And you hear about the general fund a lot. That's one fund out of more than 1,400 funds that are operated by the state of Kansas. There's lots and lots of places to look where these surplus balances might be sitting. So what we said was, let's take down the surplus that's there now and let's stop making surpluses appear. Let's reduce the sales tax transfer that's going into KDOT. Everybody knows that you pay gasoline sales tax that goes in to fund highways. What a lot of people don't know is that a large chunk of your general sales tax revenue also gets skimmed off the top, never hits the general fund. It goes to KDOT. It was 11% up to 2013, and now it's a little over 17%. So what we're saying, look, if they've been building up these surpluses, let's not give them as much of that sales tax revenue. Let's put a piece of that sales tax revenue back in the general fund. It was not dedicated to anything. Let's put it back there. Funding the Kansas Bioscience Authority at a 2014 level. That's another situation where money was put in. Lobbyists are really good at this. They put a number into a statute knowing it doesn't have to be funded, but it creates a pressure, and then revenues get reserved for it. So what they want to choose, how they want to fund the Kansas Bioscience Authority should be an appropriations matter every year. It should not be something that's sitting in a statute where money is reserved, taken off the top, and not being part of the budget process. So we're saying, let's fix this. Let's put it back into the appropriations process. The promoting employment across Kansas. There's a study that was done on the PEAK program that showed, in fact, we had the professor here from St. Louis University a couple of months ago, James brought him in, to talk about his findings showing that the businesses that received the PEAK subsidy were no more likely to create jobs than the businesses that didn't receive the subsidy. So we said, let's freeze the subsidy. There's already a contractual obligation created with the businesses that are receiving it. So let's freeze it. Let's just not allow it to grow. And that would gain $60 million over 4 years. And it doesn't change anything. It's just $60 million that doesn't have to be set aside to go to certain businesses in the future. And then there was another little, and these are just kind of tip of the iceberg type things. We wanted to identify things that are pretty easily enacted. I mean, it's come in January, pass a quick law, and you're done. These things don't require a tremendous amount of study because it's already been done. Now, some of the spending adjustments that were in our plan, and hopefully some of these are still going to be, I mean, what you saw this week was an allotment for this year. There's still a lot more that's going to be coming, possibly for this year out of the legislature, certainly in the next 2 budget years of budget cycle. School districts have large cash reserves, like KDOT and other agencies. What we proposed was reducing state aid to the districts that basically didn't spend all of their aid in the past. And this is a mechanism that's already in place. Currently, if a district has money left in its general fund, then that money is reduced from next year's aid. Well, they're allowed to move it elsewhere, so most of them move it, and there's no reduction. We're saying, look, if you have these monies that have built up, and to give you an idea of the magnitude, we're not counting capital or debt. The operating balances at school districts went from $458 million in 2005 to $860 million now. So we said, let's take just the increase in these funds, and it was based on some research done by the Department of Ed as to which funds and how much. But we said, let's look at the increase and just spend down that increase. And if we did that, it was $140 million. So districts would still have over $700 million in cash reserves if we did this. It's a one-time savings. It's money you didn't need in the past. Go spend some of it now. Universities did the same thing. We found that universities, they put their tuition into a single fund. And the cash balance in that fund had gone up $76 million since 2003. So we said, well, let's make them spend down half of that and maybe leave the other half. Maybe there'll be some goodwill and they'll give the students a break with the other half. Who says accountants don't have sense of humor? Putting new hires in a 401k plan. This would save $147 million just over the first 4 years. People who don't work for the state or school districts now, don't put them into the defined benefit or the cash balance plan, put them into a 401k plan. And this 401k plan is based on an actuarial study that Steve Anderson, who was our co-author on this plan, Steve had this done when he was still budget director. So it's based on a real actuarial study, and it's a very lucrative 401k plan where it builds up to an 8% contribution after an employee's been there 5 years. That's far better than most of us have in the private sector. But it would save $147 million just in 4 years. So these kinds of structural changes, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. These are common sense things that can be done. Now, this is a little bit hard to read because there's so many numbers on there, but let's just focus at the bottom here. What this did, we did this after the new revenue estimates came out and said, okay, we plug our plan in, new revenue estimates. If they did our plan, they would have to operate 3% more efficiently this year, 3.1% more efficiently next year, and then 0.9% more efficiently in the following year. 7% over 3 years. And notice that didn't get us to a zero ending balance. It got us to a 7.5% ending balance by the end of year 3. So if they wanted to do smaller ending balances, they could be, let's say, less efficient in the spending. Take more time to get there. There's lots of variables in this. This is the kind of what-ifing, how do you put these pieces together, what are the moving elements, kind of research that we try to provide to legislators so that they can make more informed decisions. It's never the either or that you kind of read about in the paper. The governor's allotment plan, just a couple of quick thoughts on what was announced this week. Moving money, whether it's out of KDOT or other agencies where there are surplus balances, and I underlined that and made it in yellow to emphasize these are surplus balances. This is not reducing current year revenues, it's pulling down surplus balances, leftover amounts from prior years. That makes good common sense. There's probably considerably more of that can be done going forward. It's a one-time thing. But you also want to figure out now, what do we do to structurally change so we don't have those surpluses build up again? Short funding capers got a lot of attention. What we said about that was, if all you're going to do is not make the capers payment now, that's a bad thing because you've got this big liability. But if it's part of your comprehensive plan you haven't announced yet, hint, hint, to reform capers and move new people into this defined contribution plan, the new hires, well, then obviously the actuarial study says you won't need to make that down the road. And maybe that's what they're thinking. I don't know. I certainly hope that's what they're thinking. But there could, so it's, you know, we don't want to jump to these conclusions as such has been done with some of the reporting that's going on about this allotment announcement. The across-the-board cuts, which amounts to 2% on an annualized basis, from a pragmatic standpoint, giving agencies direction with a partial year left and legislators not yet in town, that might be the only pragmatic thing to do today, but that should not be the way things are done going forward. Going forward, there should be this very meticulous analysis of every department, every function, every service. How do we provide this at a better service, better price, so we can bring down the cost and reduce without impacting the quality of the service? I wanted to show you, this is kind of hard to see here. This is what legislators were just shown. I don't know if it was in the paper yet this morning or not, but legislators yesterday were given a new analysis based on the governor's allotment that said, and it was real scary the way it was presented, because we did some revenue transfers rather than bring down spending to close the shortfall for this year. He said all you did was push it forward, which is true. And so that the headline is, now you need to make an 11% reduction next year. Well, my God, that sounds like horrible, 11%. How are you going to do that? And this is a really tiny number, but here what this is showing is $648 million would have to be cut. So if you haven't seen that in the newspaper, you might be seeing it tomorrow, either $648 million in new revenue or in less spending. Now, that's just the way these kinds of predictions get put together. This is nothing more than a what-if scenario. And so what we wanted to show you is, and this was done on the fly very early this morning after because it's still not been published, but we had somebody share that profile with us. So we very quickly tried to put together this analysis. So what happens if this is that LAVTR, what if we put that back in, which we know is not going to happen, and the revenue share, and the KBA increase of 40 million, and then put our peak and job creation fund changes in. And then we annualize the allotment. Remember, we did 4% this year for some agencies, will have an effect next year. So we annualize the piece that will go forward. We also said there was a $53 million increase assumption in there for more money needed for K-12 this year. Now, the reason for that was they said, well, we had enrollment increases. This is one of the things we're starting to look into. As I mentioned, I sit on the K-12 commission, and one of the things we've learned is that it's not been official testimony, but kind of between the lines, enrollment kind of gets gamed a little bit. I had one superintendent say, you know, I've heard this story in another district, going to parents and saying, hey, you know, you have a bunch of kids you homeschool. It'd really help our district out if you enrolled them here this week for the head count. I don't care what you do with them after that. We get the money for the whole year. You'd really be helping your district out. There's this rush to pump up the number for September 20, and then they go in and they also say, now we had more kids sign up for free and reduced lunch. Doesn't mean their costs went up, but the entitlement, the way the formula is constructed, is you need to give us more money. Doesn't mean that the school's costs went up. It means that this system says you should give us more money. So KLRD added $53 million to spending this year because of that. Well, let's go look and see if it's really needed. So we pulled that out. We also put in our excess carryover for universities and schools and new hires. And what this gets down to is that $648 million got down to $260 million pretty quickly. A lot more manageable number. And next year, these things can be, and this doesn't even begin to touch on all the revenue sources that are available for them to look at that are skimmed off the top, that in cash balances that are out there. You will get probably a lot more scary news that shouldn't be portrayed that way in the coming weeks. Ask a lot of questions. And keep this one thing in mind, if nothing else, we do not have an economic problem. We have a political problem in Kansas, and it can be solved. Thanks.